today is the second of a three-part series that we're doing on the not-for-profit industry. Today's topic is on employee engagement in advocacy and member-driven organizations. Today, we're going to be discussing topics like who is Talent Map, what and why of employee engagement, understanding engagement in trade professional nonprofit organizations, and then we'll have a short wrap-up. Just a reminder to everyone that we will have a copy of this webinar with the PowerPoint presentation and a full video available to you in about 5 business days. And I'm going to hand it over to Sean now.
Kelly, where will they be able to get a copy of that?
Yeah, you'll be able to find it on our website under webinars. And you'll actually see our previous ones on nonprofit as well as some other history ones of the past year or so. Also, for those of you who have registered and also attended today, I will be sending you an email saying thanks for joining us and a direct link to that webinar.
Perfect, thank you. And before I jump in, on the right-hand side, you'll notice that you probably have the ability to either ask questions or chat. So please feel free to pump in a question or two as we go along. Kelly's going to be monitoring the questions, and I'm going to leave some space at the end of today's webinar just to touch on any questions that come up so we can address those as we go. So without any further ado, I'll jump right in and talk a little bit about sort of today's webinar. I'll probably spend about 30 minutes or so going over the content, maybe 40 minutes, and that way we'll be wrapped up and time for you to finish up your lunch and get back at the office. I guess first of all, I always like to sort of reiterate why engagement is so important, and in particular why it's important in nonprofit or particularly trade-driven or professional associations, which are nonprofit, and they're different from what we call health or cause-driven or nonprofits, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But what we're noticing today, and this is in nonprofits particularly because they are such a knowledge-intensive type of organization. And we've noticed that over the years, human capital has become more important to these organizations. One is they've become more important to the general economy. The number of nonprofits and their input to the GDP has taken a more significant influence both in Canada and the U.S. As government has pulled back, they've often played a more important role. And as trade associations have become more influential in trying to influence laws and regulations, they're starting to pay attention and actually add people. So humans in today's workplace, and particularly in nonprofits, are becoming much more important. I always think going forward we're going to see that continuing. So even though there's lots of great technology and automation out there, people are going to be more critical than ever driving talent in these nonprofits. Let me just 2 or 3 slides on Talent Map. Some of you, I think on the call, know us as a company. Some may not, so I think it's important just to touch a little bit about where we're coming from so you can put our point of view into context. A little bit, we've been in business for over 15 years, and we really do focus on helping our clients measure employee engagement. We run hundreds of projects each year. We benchmark companies on the same sets of questions by size, by industry, geography, and we do custom as well as standard offerings. And one of our key focuses in our industry sectors are nonprofits across North America. So we work with nonprofits both in Canada and the U.S. and a range of different types of nonprofits. And that allows us to benchmark nonprofits by size, by their sector, because there are different nonprofits out there. I wanted to just give you a quick snapshot of the types of clients that we work with, both in the private sector and the public sector and the nonprofit sector. Let me just grab a marker. Up on the top here are sort of private sector industries. We work with a range of different ones from in the healthcare, public sector, private industry. We also do a lot of work with some consulting firms and provide back-end data collection and reporting services for some of the larger consulting firms out there, and have in the past been a sponsor and involved quite heavily in Canada's Top 100 Employers program, which has been great to give us insight into what's going on in engagement across the country year over year, and what some of the best practices are both in nonprofits and for-profit organizations. And we also work with a range of nonprofits and associations. I just put a smattering of clients up here to give you a sense of some of the organizations that we work with. So when we work with our clients, what we really do is we help our clients ask the right questions based on their business strategy and based on their goals and what they're trying to achieve. We then help them analyze the data and drive deep into the data, look for insights by different departments, by different groups like millennials versus boomers, those who've been with the organization a long time versus those who are new maybe. And more importantly, we help our clients act on the data. We just don't give you a survey and the report and let you ride off into the sunset. What we do is we work with you after the survey on post-survey work, such as workshops and action planning initiatives to help actually make the survey real within your organization. That's a little bit about Talent Map. Now let's start to get into the content. And I guess human capital, if you looked at how important it is, it continues to be one of the #1 challenge for CEOs, both in nonprofits and profit-seeking organizations. This is a survey, research findings from the Conference Board of Canada, or sorry, the Conference Board of the US. Each year they do a study of what the top challenges of CEOs, what's keeping them up at night. And what's interesting is their #1 challenge is human capital, and this is around the world. So in Canada, the US, in Europe, in Asia, in Middle East, human capital continues to be very important, and it's shifted not just from recruiting talent, but more towards internal talent development and engagement. So organizations not just looking how to recruit talent, but how do we develop talent, how do we engage our talent. The second most important one is around innovation and digitization. So how do we actually change the way we do business, especially with today's technology? And operational excellence. And in fact, if you looked at the strategies in this findings, 5 of the top operational excellence tactics that are in this results or report relate to human capital. So human capital is very much top of mind of executives around the world in all kinds of organizations, sectors, and industries. Why engagement is so critical to nonprofits? It allows any nonprofit, whether you're a cause-driven or member or trade-driven, to be a lot more stakeholder-focused, whether it's focused on your members that pay you fees or focused on the stakeholders that you're trying to provide the mission or the cause for. Engagement is highly linked to creative work and innovative work, and I noticed that nonprofits are trying to be, particularly in the more competitive landscape around fundraising, how do you be more creative, how do you put on more innovative approaches to driving membership and driving attention to the cause. So engagement really can help with those two. And also we notice that engagement really helps drive people to really do their best work and a lot more motivated to deliver the organization's objectives. I'm not going to go through all of the links. I know many of you on the call today's webinar are familiar with engagement and the drivers of engagement, but it's always good to pay attention to how they link to the business outcomes. And there's 3 really good pieces of evidence that you can find. Engaging for Success, that's at engageforsuccess.org. Nailing the Evidence, it's at the same website, and it's excellent because it shows all of the evidence that's been produced around linking engagement to a whole bunch of business outcomes, both for profit and nonprofit, and well-being on engagement. So some good locations, and contact us and we can send you these reports and evidence that shows how engagement drives better business performance. All right. So almost no matter which way you cut it, engagement has a big impact on the business. But probably what's more important, it actually has a big impact on the employee too. I'm not going to go through these studies. I touch on them every once in a while. But needless to say, there's a strong link between engaged people and engaged employees in the workplace and better health and wellness outcomes. And the reason is because there's a belief and a study now with evidence that shows that engagement is impacting you at work, and it's something you take home with you. It affects you psychologically and physiologically, so it really has a big impact on your day-to-day work. And it's something that you take home with you. It's not something that you just can leave at the office. So how you engage your staff impacts them far beyond the 9 to 5 or the workplace that you have in today's organizations. These studies are interesting. I'm just going to touch on one of them here. This one's interesting because it sort of talks about how a child's sense of well-being is affected by other parents that enjoy their work, and it looked at highly engaged parents versus disengaged parents, and then it followed these parents home and studied their children's activity or how they behaved in the school the following week. And what they found were highly disengaged parents tended to affect their children's behavior because those children seem to, or actually statistically, called out at school, were pulled to the office more often, had issues at school with teachers than parents that were highly engaged. So there are differences between that, and actually you bring engagement home and it affects the workplace, and not only that, but affects home. I'm going to quickly touch on satisfaction and engagement. I know some of you are familiar with these concepts, but just bear with for a minute. But when you do measure engagement, it is very different than job satisfaction. Job satisfaction is a good measure, but it really focuses on what the employee gets. What's in it for me as an employee? Whereas engagement is focused much more on what the employee is willing to give back. And that's the biggest difference in how you ask those questions. You can determine the level of employee focus and urgency, enthusiasm, adaptability by asking the right questions in the right way. And you can understand what employees are willing to give back to your organization. Whereas job satisfaction, you can't get it from a job satisfaction survey. So they are different. I'm not going to go through my definition here, TELMAP of engagement, but I do want to point out a couple of things. It's very much a measure of cognitive and emotional investment of personal energy. And I'm going to point out a couple of things. So cognitive and emotional, so that's the way people think and how they feel. So those two things. And also I want to point out it's an investment. It's something that people choose to put into your organization. And that usually is a level of personal energy. So this is a choice that people make. So you can't really engage an employee. All you can do is create the environment that enables them to choose to become engaged or not. So it's something that it's really creating a culture of engagement that is important as opposed to creating just engaged employees. So it's creating an environment where they can become engaged. If anything, I always encourage you to think about engagement's often equated with two simple words. It's discretionary effort. And whenever we measure engagement with our clients, what we're measuring is where do they stack up on that level of discretionary effort. The lowest level of discretionary effort, basically no effort, extra effort, you do just enough to keep your job. You don't get fired, but you don't stick out. You don't do anything unusual. You don't go the extra mile. That's the lowest level of engagement, 0 level of engagement, all the way up to when you're firing in all cylinders. So that's where you're trying to measure is where does your workforce stack up on that, and where do your different departments stack up on that. Trying to piece it all together for you within a trade-driven or professional association is often in professional association, which are different from cause-driven associations, they focus on a couple of key things. They focus on retention, and that's sometimes hard for these organizations, and part of the reason why trade-driven organizations, people don't necessarily always join a trade-driven organization because of the mission or the cause of the organization. And that's different. In member-driven organizations, if you're driven on a cancer society or an environmental cause, people are driven there not because of the job, but because of what the organization stands for. And that's different than what we see in trade-driven organizations. People are driven there because they want to see the organization drive something at an industry level, whether it's engineers, egg farmers, milk producers, industry association around recording. It really depends. So they really want to do something different for their career. So it's much more career-driven than mission-driven. but they do measure a couple of things. So because it's career-driven, people often come and go in trade associations. They'll work in industry, they'll go into the association, then they'll go back into industry because they can get some very good experience, and it's often a stepping stone to developing a higher level career within private sector. So employee retention is often a real concern and big issue in these organizations. The other thing that really becomes important is on the member side. Member retention, member satisfaction. Often trade-driven associations are not the only game in town. People can join one or two different trade associations, and over time, you have to often compete for that. So it's closer to a profit than a nonprofit organization in those respects. Whenever we do measure engagement, what we try to do is try to understand what are the factors that drive engagement in this type of organization. And we know that these factors will drive these types of attitudes, and then attitudes are really what lead to behaviors. And it's the behaviors that lead to your business outcomes. So whenever we work with an organization, we always make sure that we talk to the executive ahead of time. And by talking with the executive, we can start to understand what is it that drives their business. And from understanding what drives their business, then we go and start to design the actual sets of questions that will drive the attitudes and behaviors that drive the outcome of their business. So let me just touch on, and you'll see how this fits again a little bit later on. Let me just touch on effective questionnaire design, because what's important to the business, whether it's a not-for-profit in a cause-driven situation or a trade-driven situation, how you design the types of questions, the engagement questions, and the other factors that drive engagement affect the outcomes you're going to get, which then affect the types of behaviors that you'll want to see in your leadership team and your management team and your staff overall. So one of the biggest challenges that we see are poor questionnaire fundamentals. People don't take the time to design the questions correctly. They don't take the time necessarily when running surveys to link the questions to their business drivers. And they don't think about how surveys should be designed from an independent and dependent variable point of view. So I'm going to touch a little bit about that, and then that'll lead into one of the key sort of ahas that we've learned that differentiates trade-driven and cause-driven nonprofits that we work with. So let's just, before I jump in, just to give a sense of types of nonprofit organizations, and there's many different ways to categorize these. There's, generally speaking, there's public charities. Usually they're health or educational-driven types of charities out there that are trying to do good for society and good for a community. Could be national, international, or community-based. There's also foundations, and foundations are also nonprofits. But typically, what they do is they collect money and then they issue money out to other charities or other nonprofits. Not always the case, but often that's what they do. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one example. They don't actually do a lot of the work in terms of the science and in terms of understanding issues. What they do is they have the money that they give out to the charities. So types of charities. There's another type which we often work with. Whether they're cause-driven or social advocacy organizations. They could be around wildlife. They could be around, like Greenpeace would be a very good example, the Sierra Club. Also, health-driven issues like diabetes or cancer. Those are type of advocacy types of organizations where they're really driving towards a key mission or vision. What I'm focusing on today is professional and trade-driven organizations. And professional trade-driven, really are formed to provide programs and services to a group of people in the same profession. We've worked with a whole range of them, but it could be like the National Writers Union or the International Association of Meeting Planners. So there's quite a number of these professional and trade organizations that we work with. And they're different in different countries. So because your laws are different in the U.S. versus the laws in Canada, the issues that they're dealing with and how they go about dealing with them are slightly different, but often they're organized in some similar ways. Typically, these professional trade, of course, are members pay dues to join these, and they also receive discounted on career training and other services that are common to the trade association. So I'm going to focus a little more on these with some links back to what we did last time on cause-driven organizations. So let me now start to talk about the design of engagement surveys in these types of organizations. One of the most important things whenever you go and launch a survey, whether it's in a cause-driven or trade-driven association, is the design of the questionnaire itself. And when I talk about the design, it's around the design of the type of engagement you're trying to measure, as well as the design of the dimensions, or what we call drivers, that influence engagement. A well-designed survey will have an employee engagement measure that links to what's important for that type of organization. And the drivers that drive or affect engagement will also link to the factors that influence engagement in that type of organization. And for example, teamwork might be really important in some industry, healthcare for example, but not as important in other industries, investment banking as another example. So different drivers can affect different things or different employee engagement levels in organizations. The other thing I want to point out too that we really notice difference, and I'll touch on this a little later, is that there's a big difference between trade and cause-driven organizations in the type of engagement that's important to them. The types of engagement we can talk about right here is job or task engagement and organizational engagement. Let me break those two down, and they're subtle, but they're very important. Job or task engagement is whenever someone's engaged in the job, really focused on the job, interested in the task itself, interested in doing the job, gets into that flow mindset when they're doing the work. But they may or may not have any interest in the wider mission vision of the organization. Conversely, organizational engagement is when someone's really drawn to the mission of the organization, the vision of the organization, what the organization stands for. However, they may or may not be driven and engaged in their actual tasks or jobs. So it's important to understand people can be engaged in different things, and there's both academic research that shows this as well as practitioner research that links. In fact, there's a well-known professor out of University of Toronto, Professor Sachs, who's done research on proving the differences between job engagement and organizational engagement. I'll give you a quick example, and before I'll move on. Hospital and healthcare. We have the opportunity to work with a lot of healthcare, a lot of hospitals. And what we notice is physicians, doctors, they are very engaged in their task or their job. When we measure engagement and start to break engagement down into two components, task engagement and organizational engagement, we notice that physicians are highly engaged in their job. They love what they're doing. They love interacting with patients. However, when we measure how engaged are they with the organization that they work in, the hospital itself, they have very low levels of engagement. They're not interested in the administration of the hospital. They're not interested in what the hospital is trying to do. And they're not interested in even helping move the needle around improving the organization. But what's interesting for health, and the challenge for healthcare, is doctors represent such an important part of the healthcare equation. And without their buy-in to not just their job or task engagement, but the overall engagement, really presents a lot of challenges. But that's an example where different levels of engagement by the same individual, very engaged in the task, not engaged in the organization. I'll touch on that more in a little bit. So thinking about questionnaire design and how it impacts the type of industry that you're in. If you think about a trade or member-driven associations, professional associations, a big part of what they focus on is members on the right-hand side, and also maybe advocacy attainment. Are they changing regulations? Are they changing the goals? Are they changing the laws that this association competes in? And we know that member satisfaction drives member revenue and to some extent advocacy. If the association is doing good work and changing the laws in favor of that trade association, members tend to be more happy because they have better outcomes in their business and so on. And we know that member value drives member satisfaction. Now, how do you achieve member value? Well, three key areas is employee productivity, the association productivity. Are they actually doing stuff and getting work done? Are they putting in discretionary effort? And are they staying around long enough and they're not jumping back into private industry quickly and not really getting the job done, especially when you look at how they impact rules, laws, regulations, because it takes a long time to lobby on particular areas or issues. And we know that engagement drives these factors. So a highly engaged workforce can drive member value, member satisfaction. But what's important is understanding the type of engagement that is important to your type of organization, and how important is task engagement or job engagement versus organizational engagement, because they are two different types, and you can actually measure those two different types. So the types of questions that you ask in understanding what drives engagement in your organization should be geared more towards either task engagement or job engagement, if that's important, or organizational engagement, if that's important. So one size doesn't fit all, and it's important to start to think about the nuances within your organizations. So let me just explain why those nuances are important, and then touch on what we've seen in the two types of industries. So often in generic survey design, you have your employee engagement factor that you're measuring, and it's usually made up of a handful of questions. We have 6 questions. 3 of them measure job engagement, 3 of them measure organizational engagement. And we also have a whole factor of independent variables, things that we think influence employee engagement for your organization. Here's a standard set of ones that we use at Telemap. But your organization might be different. You might say teamwork's not important, but diversity is really important. Or we need to add safety because that's an issue. So these ones that you see here are ones that are very common. You see a lot of well-designed employee culture surveys, employee engagement surveys. But it's important to understand that it's not just the survey and the boxes that are in the survey, but it's the relationship between these boxes. And whenever you design a survey, you should always have one dependent variable or a dependent variable for your model, and a number of different independent variables, the things that you think have an influence. So that way, whenever you do your analysis, you can actually analyze how each independent variable influences your dependent variable. When we do that at Telemap, we're able to identify things like, and this is just an example, number one variable that influences engagement in this example is teamwork, innovation, and professional growth, 1, 2, and 3. Those are the factors that have the biggest influence. And we simply do that by using statistics. What we do is we hold all the other factors constant, and then we play increase or decrease the innovation factor. And we see how it influences the engagement score. And if we increase it, does it go up or does it go down? And if all the other things are held constant and it goes up or down, then we know it becomes a factor. If we just simply increase or decrease the innovation score, all the other things held constant, and engagement score didn't change, then it's not a factor. So that's a little bit of insight in how we actually determine through the stats. So we're able to produce something like this. Here are all your survey drivers, your statistical analysis, usually a key driver, and we're trying to understand or predict what affects employee engagement. And in this case, these are the 3 most important drivers that affect employee engagement. Just to give you a visual on how the actual stats look like, this is an example. It's a correlation, and regression does the same thing, but it has multiple correlations going on at the same time. But essentially, on an engagement survey, you've got a 1 and a 5 on a 5-point scale. And maybe teamwork, you have a 1 and a 5 on a 5-point scale. And this little dot would represent somebody's score. This individual scored very high on teamwork, and they scored very high on engagement. And so that's strong correlation between the two. Whereas this dot represents another individual. They scored low on teamwork and low on engagement. And you can see all the other dots in here were perfectly correlated, meaning as the teamwork score increased, so did the employee engagement score. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we're looking at a shotgun blast, and there's no pattern to this or no correlation to this. if this was teamwork at the bottom and engagement on the vertical axis, basically what you could say is, well, some people scored high on teamwork and relatively low on engagement. Other people scored high on teamwork and high on engagement. So there's no pattern to the data. There's no line or predictability of the data. But in survey data, most data looks sort of like this. It's not near as messy as the 0. It's not near as clean as the 1. And this allows us to show a pattern. So for this example, most people scored higher on teamwork, if the teamwork was still the variable here and engagement was here. And as teamwork scores went up, engagement scores went up. The stronger the correlation, the more important it is as a driver. The weaker the correlation, the less important it is. So what we're able to do is look at all the dependent variable, look at the dependent variable, and look at all the independent variable, and actually rank order from highest to lowest what's most important to your organization to what's least important to your organization. And actually be able to tell you that something like teamwork is 2 times more important than professional growth, for example, in this organization. And in fact, it's 4 times more important than work environment. So you can actually start to see where you should be spending your dollars going forward. And to give you a visual on how we share this with executive teams, we're able to actually show if you're a weak driver of engagement or strong driver of engagement. A strong driver of engagement is represented by this sort of little graph here. This is a weak driver of engagement, stuff that looks like a shotgun blast. So everything to the left-hand side of this is not very good. In fact, it's a weak driver of engagement. It's not a 0, but it's less important. Everything to the right of this graph is much more important. Everything above here is a strength. Everything below this horizontal line is a weakness. So you can see outlined in red here is teamwork and innovation. It's an area that's below the industry average, and it's really important to the employees. It's a strong driver of engagement. Whereas work environment is a little bit above average, and it's a fairly strong driver of engagement. So this organization's doing work environment and professional growth fairly well. So that's the ways to be able to analyze the data based on your variables, all using engagement as the area you're trying to predict. You can use other dependent variables like turnover or leadership. So there's other ways to do it, but we're focusing on engagement. So whenever we do that, basically what we do is we make sure that you have a good model, and that model is driven by your business outcomes. And we work with your leadership team to do that. Clean your data, review your response rates, review basic descriptive stats, what's the range of your data, the frequency of your data, review the written comment, and then most important, we run a key driver analysis. And that key driver analysis has to be built into the survey design itself. It can't be something you do after the fact. You have to think about the variables before you design the survey. And you have to understand what the independent and dependent variables are. After you do that analysis, it's always good to go back and say, well, what are we seeing in the industry? Are the drivers we get similar to other drivers in our sector? And we'd expect them to be fairly similar, but there are sometimes differences because every organization is different. And then really represent your data to the leadership team. So that's sort of the process that we follow. Now let's get back to trade organizations and talk a little bit about what are the key drivers in trade-driven associations. And what we find is, based on the models that we create, job or task engagement is a lot more important in trade or professional associations than organizational engagement. Let me say that again. Job or task engagement is a lot more important to professional organizations, employees in professional organizations, than the vision of the organization or the mission. Not that it's unimportant, the mission or vision, but that's much more important. I'll explain why in a little bit. That's different than what we see in cause-based organizations. For those, I don't know if some of you may have been on this webinar last month, and we actually showed what drives engagement in cause-based organizations. So these are often, the organizations that are driven for maybe for the Cancer Society or an environmental cause. Those types of cause-based organizations, when we analyze the data using these independent variables in general and this dependent variable, we find that the #1 factor is organizational vision. And in fact, it's 5 times more important than many other factors like immediate management, work-life balance, compensation, and so on. So it's by far the most important variable. People want to believe in what they're doing has a greater impact on society, and they join that organization because they believe their job is going to have an impact on something greater than themselves. The second most important is professional growth. Not surprised. People, as humans, always want to learn and grow. And the third one is innovation. And that's sometimes interesting. But innovation is actually a message to the leadership team around getting organized around how these organizations do a good job of holding on to people and really providing them the tools to do good work. What we find in cause-driven organizations, their management levels and levels of tools and sophistication is not quite as sophisticated as they should be or could be. And as a result, innovation, how they do their work, becomes a real big issue for a lot of employees. So those are the top three in cause-based. When we look at trade-driven nonprofits, so these are professional associations, Chartered Accountants Association or the Canadian Public Accounting Association, professional growth is actually the most important factor. People want to learn and grow and develop their career, and often and that's what I was talking about earlier, they often come and go in and out of these organizations. They'll work in an association, then they'll go back to industry, and then maybe even come back to the association. So there's a lot more back and forth into industry. Teamwork is number two. It's three times the impact on engagement versus things like compensation or vision. And number three is senior leadership in terms of who they're working with and how they're led by. I think part of the reason is, particularly in Canada, a lot of these trade associations are smaller organizations, so senior leadership have a big impact on small organizations, followed by information and member focus. So I'm maybe not surprised by those. So what's interesting that we see between trade-driven organizations, which are the table on the right-hand side, and cause-driven, which is what we had a chance to present last month. Cause-driven organizations, org vision is by far the first most important factor. In trade-driven, it's professional growth. Number two is professional growth in cause. Number two is teamwork. Three is innovation. Number three is leadership. So very different factors in general that drives engagement in trade-driven organizations. Now, that's not necessarily what your organization exactly will look like. It really depends on your organization, your workforce, where you're at, the status of your and maturity of your organization. So it may change. But this is when we looked at all of our benchmark across 30 organizations. We found that these are the factors that drove it. And I think one of the reasons why they drive it is because you have to start to understand there's different types of engagement. And there's what I call job or task engagement that I referred to earlier in the physician example, and organizational engagement. And what we find when we look at our data is employees in trade-driven organizations are a lot more focused on or have higher levels of job or task engagement and lower levels of organizational engagement. And it's the exact opposite in cause-driven organizations or cause-driven nonprofits. Cause-driven have very high org engagement but very low task engagement. So what we often find is some nonprofits, they can excel at both, but very few excel at both job and task. And it's important to excel at both job and task. However, it's good to know where you stack up and what's most important to your employees based on the type of industry you're in, as well as based on the type of organization you are. So just to wrap up, what we find is most managers in nonprofit tend to very much underestimate the impact of employee engagement. And I think part of the reason why is often nonprofit leaders, when they join it, they do join for a number of reasons, and they find people management as one of often the most depleting parts of their job. And it's often because systems are put in place to achieve the goals, whether it's advocacy or member revenue-driven programs, but very few systems are put in place to provide good people management, good leadership development, good training. And employee engagement can help facilitate those dialogues and discussion, employee engagement surveys, but it's usually the last thing on the list in these types of organizations, even as they get to scale of maybe 75, 100, 200, 300 employees, where private organizations pay attention to people issues and management HR systems much earlier in the process. What can nonprofits do, and in particularly trade or professional nonprofits, how do they focus on job or task engagement? What are some things that affect that? And this is a list of research-based activities that managers in these types of organizations should focus on. So even though I know when we hear about engagement, we always talk about the mission and the meaning and how important that is, and you've got to create a line of sight to what the greater purpose of the organization is, but that's not always true. What we find is in trade or professional organizations, high engagement of job or task engagement is more important than organizational engagement. And ways to do that, obviously training on their job so they get better at the job, they get more efficient and have higher levels of what they call self-efficacy and feeling I'm good at what I'm doing. Giving them a lot more flexibility, we see really helps drive because they can do their job when they want to do it, they get more engaged in their task. Mentors are expert employees, especially if you're new to the association, being able to tap into people who can help you get the job done better, access to necessary information, equipment, materials for job completion or task completion, making sure that employees have the tools. So if they're traveling or they're out often visiting stakeholders or members, do they have easy access to files? Can they log on to systems and actually get information quickly? Or is it a real hassle? Do you have to go through a slow VPN, and that VPN takes a long time to download files, and it makes it very difficult to do your job well? Work distribution, how work is distributed within the organization can affect very much job and task engagement. Job control, level of job control over what you can and can't do. A voice to suggest process improvements, giving employees the opportunity to provide changes to the way the job or task is done, and the appropriate level of autonomy depending on the role and the position. So those are some things that we see really drive higher levels of job or task engagement, which then can drive higher levels of employee engagement in trade-driven and professional-driven nonprofit associations. Just to wrap up, there is a good study available on our website also. It's called Engaging the Nonprofit Workforce. It's not a study we did, but I highly recommend it. We have it available. It's mission management and emotion. Those interested in engaging in nonprofit workplace, I highly recommend you view this report. It's an easy read, but it's an interesting read and gives you a different perspective on employee engagement in the nonprofit sector. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. I wanted to leave a few minutes, which I did, for questions that might come up, and I'll flip it over there. If there's no questions, then hopefully everybody will enjoy the value here today, and they'll get back at their lunch. But if there is questions, I'll be able to ask or answer a few questions. So Kelly, maybe I'll turn it back over to you.
Hi, Sean. Thank you very much. I have just one question here. Are there different measures between task versus organizational engagement?
Yeah, that's a good question. Task engagement is actually measured with different sets of questions than organizational engagement. So they are different questions, and they're asked in a slightly different way. Now, whenever they're done on a survey, they're actually grouped together, and it's a little bit hard. You can't just, if you first look at it, you may not be able to say, oh, that's a organizational engagement type question, or that's a task or job type question. But for example, one of the questions around task or job engagement is around, for example, level of energy you get from doing your job or task. When I'm doing my job or task, do I get a high level of energy or not? So that's a little more focused on task engagement, whereas organizational engagement is more around, I can see a clear link between my work and the long-term organizational objectives. That's a little bit more specific to organizational engagement. So they are different questions. You can actually come up with an index for either one. You can come up with a task engagement index and you can also come up with a organizational engagement index, and you can combine them together and come up with a sort of a mega index, an employee engagement index that adds the two or averages the two together. So good question. Thank you, Kelly.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sean. So we're just going to cover some of our upcoming Talent Map learning sessions that we have, whether it's different conferences or webinars coming up. So on November 9th and 10th, which is coming very shortly, we have Corporate Culture Conference with the Conference Board of Canada. And Sean's going to be speaking at that. And it's also a trade show, and it's creating cultures that support your strategy. So a great conference there. Also, we have a webinar with Norm, our VP Engagement, on November 10th. He's going to be covering municipalities, a special sector requiring a special approach. And that's a live webinar at noon Eastern Standard Time on November 10th. And then we have our Top Employer Summit, which is going to be in Vancouver. Sean will be speaking at that event as well, together with writers and organizers of Canada's Top 100 Employers Project. And George Takei is the key speaker there from Star Trek, so that's going to be very exciting. On November 14th, 2016 this year, and then coming up after that is HR Leader Summit, so there's lots of conferences in November. November 16th, that's going to be a conference with senior HR professionals to discuss most pressing industry challenges, and that's going to be in Toronto. And then finally, our third webinar of our TRIO series on nonprofit organizations. Sean's going to be having a webinar on December 1st about manager best practices in not-for-profit organizations. So you won't want to miss that. You can find out how to register for that, obviously, on our website again under the webinar section. And you should be receiving an email in about 5 business days from me thanking you for joining us today, and also a direct link to the PowerPoint deck from today's presentation, as well as the video. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thanks so much, Sean, for your presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.